The Sun is a British tabloid newspaper that doesn't exactly have the best reputation. It's known for its sensationalist reporting, unethical standards, and various scandals over the years. During a trial related to one of these scandals, the ex-deputy news editor testified that a 7-foot-high safe existed, containing over 30 years' worth of unpublished information, some of which sounds like it would cause outrage and potentially even criminal investigations if it was ever released. Let's investigate. If you enjoy internet mysteries and generally disturbing content, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. I also have a Patreon and a PayPal, so if you're interested in supporting the channel, feel free to check those out, links will be in the description. Thanks to Minardi, one of my patrons, for suggesting this topic. This video will contain vague discussions of topics that might be triggering to some. Viewer discretion is advised. You can head over to my Patreon for an uncut version of this video which features extra disturbing details that were unsuitable for this cut. Before we get onto the safe and what it might contain, it would be useful to provide some backstory on the News of the World phone hacking scandal that preceded it. News of the World was a weekly tabloid newspaper that was at one point the world's highest selling English language paper. It mainly focused on celebrity gossip, exposing drug use and sexual misdemeanours with questionably obtained photo and video evidence. They were known for checkbook journalism, which is where reporters pay sources for their information, and while that has its uses as some individuals won't speak without financial incentive, it's considered unethical by many because it can cast doubt on the credibility of information and on the ability of the reporter to remain unbiased. They also outright lied about some individuals, fabricated stories, and were involved in various other scandals. Wikipedia does a good job of summarising, so I'll read some excerpts. The paper began a controversial campaign to name and shame alleged pedophiles in July 2000, following the abduction and murder of Sarah Payne in West Sussex. The paper's decision led to some instances of action being taken against those suspected of being child sex offenders, which included several cases of mistaken identity, including one instance where a paediatrician had her house vandalised, and another where a man was confronted because he had a neck brace similar to one a pedophile was wearing when pictured. In 2002, Maza Mahmood, an uncover reporter working for the News of the World, also known as the Fake Sheikh, allegedly exposed a plot to kidnap Victoria Beckham. 5 men were arrested, but the trial later collapsed when it emerged News of the World had paid its main witness, Florim Gashi, £10,000 to work with Maza Mahmood. Florim Gashi later admitted to working with Mahmood to set up the kidnap plot. In 1988, the parents of actor David Scarborough, who played Mark Fowler on the BBC soap opera EastEnders, commenced libel proceedings with solicitor Michael Shelton due to the hounding of Scarborough whilst he suffered from mental illness. During this time, the News of the World and its sister paper The Sun published stories calling Scarborough a zombie as well as Dracula and purported that he took cocaine. According to the parents, this escalated Scarborough's depression, resulting in his on the 27th of April 1988. In April 2006, England footballer Wayne Rooney received £100,000 in damages from the publishers of the News of the World and its sister paper The Sun over articles falsely reporting that he had slapped his fiancée. In 2009, Barry George, a man who had been falsely convicted of murdering television presenter Jill Dando, won a libel claim filed against the publisher of the News of the World after the paper fabricated quotes to suggest he had stalked other women. In 2011, Polish footballer Artur Boruk won an out-of-court settlement against the News of the World after the newspaper made false allegations that he was unfaithful to his girlfriend. Boruk was paid £70,000 and a full apology was issued. In addition, former features editor Paul McMullen admitted in 2010 that News of the World, specifically his own articles, had contributed significantly to Jennifer Elliott taking her own life, in his opinion. He had published information about her in numerous articles over the years that had been obtained after his colleague bribed a police officer. I hope you've heard enough to persuade you that the paper was absolute trash. Not only did they show blatant disregard for people's mental health and personal relationships, but risked hindering criminal investigations and more than likely contributed to the deaths of more than one individual. That's not all though. The most notorious controversy surrounding the paper is what led to its demise in 2011, the phone hacking scandal. Back in 2005, senior aides to the British royal family started to become suspicious when they noticed new messages showing up in their voicemails that had already been listened to, among other unusual things. More worryingly, stories began appearing in News of the World about Prince William. Nothing particularly juicy, for example a headline about him pulling a tendon in his knee, but he hadn't spoken about that publicly, so it was initially suspected that there might be a mole. When another article popped up about William borrowing a portable editing suite from ITV royal correspondent Tom Brady, he realised someone must have been accessing his voicemails, as only those two knew about the arrangement and hadn't told anyone else. They contacted the Metropolitan Police and an investigation was launched, which found that it was the senior aides' phones that had been hacked, and those of government ministers, military chiefs, footballers and celebrities too. This was back before smartphones were widespread, and if you remember the struggle of having to press one button 4 times just to type the letter S, you'll know that leaving a voicemail about important issues was much easier than typing out a long text. Hence information was gained from hacking the voicemails. A few years prior to this revelation, it had become clear that an organised trade in confidential personal information had developed and was widely used by British newspapers. Some of this information was obtained via illegal means, such as entrapment, blackmail and burglaries, in addition to phone and computer hacking. Between 1999 and 2003, as part of Operation Nigeria, several private investigators who were providing information to News of the World were convicted for crimes including drug distribution, CP, corruption, and planting evidence, though none were charged with illegal acquisition of confidential information. So this activity was nothing new, but it had stepped up a notch now members of the royal family were being targeted. Police began surveilling Clive Goodman, former royal editor for News of the World, and Glenn Mulcair, former footballer turned private investigator who also worked for the paper. And during this time, Clive reported on a story about Prince Harry visiting a strip club. More information that was not public knowledge. In August 2006, the pair were arrested and later charged with hacking various phones. During the trial, it was revealed that they had made a total of 609 calls to the royal staff members' numbers, which is how they were able to access the voicemails after guessing the pins. Clive pled guilty to the charges and was sentenced to 4 months in prison, and Glenn was jailed for 6 months. Clive was fired from News of the World and even had the audacity to file an unfair dismissal claim. That might not be as ridiculous as it first sounds though, as the royal hacking scandal was only the tip of the iceberg, and arguably, Clive may have simply been a product of an industry that was rife with such behaviour. Throughout the investigation, police had been criticised for honing in on associates of the royal family who had been hacked, largely ignoring the numerous other victims, even though several thousand phone numbers of potential hacking victims and 91 phone PIN codes had been found in Glenn's possession. Not to mention God knows how many other journalists working for various tabloids that were likely using the same unethical methods to obtain the next sensational headline. Scotland Yard was accused of turning a blind eye to this activity within News of the World because of their close relationship, probably not helped by the fact that some officers allegedly took bribes from the journalists, and they, the Press Complaints Commission and News International, former publisher of News of the World, assured the public that no other journalists had been involved. It wasn't until 2011 that wider-scale investigations were launched into the hacking and bribery allegations, after journalists from The Guardian and other papers reported on evidence that suggested this activity was still ongoing, and more widespread than the public initially realised. Police had previously refused to investigate further, which caused several public figures who had allegedly been hacked to begin litigation proceedings against News International, and during one of these, evidence of indirect hacking, breaches of national security, and serious crime was found. Operation Wheating focused on the phone hacking and commenced on the 26th of January 2011, with around 45 officers investigating, which increased to 60 a few months later, then 90 the following year. On the 4th of July, The Guardian reported that police had found evidence to suggest that News of the World journalists had hired private investigators to hack into Millie Dowler's voicemail. Millie was 13 years old when she was reported missing in March 2002 after failing to return home from school. Tragically, her remains were found in September that year, and it turned out she'd been murdered the day after she disappeared. The Guardian initially reported that News of the World journalists had deleted messages to clear space for new ones, which gave the family false hope because they thought Millie must still be alive and had deleted them herself. But in actuality, the phone automatically deleted messages 72 hours after they'd been opened. Nevertheless, they had hacked a missing girl's phone, and what's worse, it was revealed in 2012 that Surrey police and others were made aware of the incident shortly after they knew of Millie's death and took no action, instead inviting the staff to a meeting to discuss the case. On the 7th of July, just 3 days after the Guardian's article, Rupert Murdoch, who owned News of the World, announced that the paper would be discontinued. The final edition would be on the 12th of July 2011, and all proceeds were to go to good causes, with advertising space given to charities. Following the scandal, several senior employees and executives resigned from News International and its parent company. Later in July, it was alleged that News of the World hacked into the voicemail of Sarah Payne, mother of Sarah Payne, an 8-year-old girl who was murdered in July 2000 by Roy Whiting. Not only was the hacking unethical, but kinda two-faced of them too, considering how they had campaigned in favour of Sarah's law, which would allow parents to find out if a child offender lived in the area. Sarah had written a column for the final News of the World issue in which she said that the staff, quote, supported me through some of the darkest, most difficult times of my life and became my trusted friends. After finding out her voicemail was hacked, she was apparently absolutely devastated and deeply disappointed. It has also been reported that relatives of British soldiers killed in action in Iraq and Afghanistan since 2001, and relatives of victims of the July 2005 London bombings all had their phones hacked by News of the World. A total of around 3,000 people are thought to have had their phones hacked, but the number could be higher than 6,000. Public figures who it's thought were hacked include Paul McCartney, Elton John, Paul O'Grady, Angelina Jolie, Tony Blair, Noel Fielding, Sienna Miller, Jude Law, Sean Connery, Hugh Grant, Ulrika Johnson, Kerry Katona, Gary Lineker, Nigella Lawson, Joanna Lumley, Richard Madele, Ashley Cole, Gwyneth Paltrow, Brad Pitt, and Chris Tarrant, among many other celebrities, politicians, and members of or associates of the royal family. By mid-2012, 23 people had been arrested and 8 had been charged. Rebecca Brooks, News International Chief Executive and former News of the World editor, Andy Coulson, editor, Stuart Kuttner, Managing Editor, Greg Miskiw, News Desk Editor, all of whom had been arrested on suspicion of corruption and conspiring to intercept communications. Ian Edmondson, editor, Neville Thurlback, chief reporter, and James Weatherup, news editor, allegedly conspired to intercept communications and unlawfully intercepted voicemail messages. Glenn Mulcair, who had been convicted in relation to the royal phone hacking, was sentenced to 6 months in prison, suspended for 12 months, and made to do 200 hours community service. Andy Coulson was sentenced to 18 months in prison, while Rebecca Brooks, who it was revealed had an affair with Andy for roughly the duration of the scandal, was acquitted of all charges. Stuart Kuttner was found not guilty, Greg Miskiw and Neville Thurlback both pled guilty and were each sentenced to 6 months in prison. Ian Edmondson was sentenced to 18 months, and James Weatherup pled guilty and received a suspended sentence and 200 hours community service. Clive Goodman, who had been convicted for his involvement in the royal phone hacking, was arrested on suspicion of corruption, but later found not guilty of all charges. During Operation Weeting, investigators found evidence to suggest that some police personnel accepted inappropriate payments from news organisations in return for classified information, and so Operation Elvedon was launched. Convictions that resulted include April Casburn, a detective chief inspector and one of the Met's most senior counter-terrorism officers, who was found guilty of offering to sell inside information on the phone hacking probe to News of the World and sentenced to 15 months in prison. Paul Flatley, a police officer who pled guilty to conspiring to commit misconduct in public office. Scott Chapman, a police officer, and his partner Lynn Gaffney, found guilty of the same offence after being paid up to £40,000 for information about John Venables, who murdered 2-year-old James Bulger when he was 10 with a friend of the same age. An unnamed News of the World journalist who paid Scott for that information Timothy Edwards, an anti-terrorism police officer who pled guilty to misconduct in a public office, Anthony Franz, a reporter for The Sun, who was found guilty of aiding and abetting misconduct in a public office after paying Timothy over £22,000 for information, and Simon Quinn, a former police officer who was found guilty of leaking information about murder inquiries to journalists, including information about Millie Dowler. 4 journalists who worked for The Sun were acquitted, including John Kay, who argued his contact with 2 military sources had been in the public interest and incidentally was convicted of manslaughter in 1977 after drowning his wife in the bath and passing it off as a nervous breakdown. He was admitted to a psychiatric facility, then rehired by The Sun when he was allowed out. Anyway, Operation Elvedon resulted in a total of 34 convictions, including 9 police officers and 2 journalists. News of the World was obviously hit hardest by the scandal and was the only paper to have closed as a result. Hardly surprising considering it appeared that everyone who worked there knew what was going on, as did some police officers who abused their position and seemingly helped cover it up. Staff of other papers were up to the same tricks though, including The Sun, News of the World's sister paper, also owned by Rupert Murdoch. Following the closure of News of the World, it was rumoured that a Sunday issue of The Sun would replace it, and sure enough, The Sun on Sunday was launched in February 2012, with some journalists from the former getting hired to work for the latter. The Sun was founded in 1964 and became a tabloid when it was purchased by Rupert 5 years later. Before it was succeeded by Metro in 2018, it had the largest circulation of any daily newspaper in the UK. Just like News of the World, it's faced much criticism over the years. Here's a brief and far from complete history of the many controversies. In 1985, one of the headlines read, "I'd shoot my son if he had AIDS," says Vicar. Beginning in February 1987, The Sun published multiple false stories about Elton John, one being that he had his dog's voice boxes surgically removed. In May, they offered free one-way plane tickets to Norway for gay men to permanently leave the country under the headline, "Fly away gays and we will pay." Later that year, a story about poet Benjamin Zephaniah was titled, "Would you let this man near your daughter?" and said, quote, "He is black," and later, "He looks like he could do with a shampoo and a scrub." In November 1989, one of their headlines read, "Straight cannot give you AIDS, official," having already termed the virus the US gay blood plague 6 years earlier. It was claimed, quote, "The risk of catching AIDS if you are heterosexual is statistically invisible, in other words, impossible." Not only would that have undoubtedly contributed to the homophobia that surrounded AIDS, but their claim factually wasn't true, and it's entirely possible that readers could have contracted AIDS after reading that, lulled into a false sense of security because they were straight. In April 1989, 97 people were killed and 766 injured in the Hillsborough disaster, a human crush which occurred during a football match at Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield. South Yorkshire police alleged that the incident was caused by Liverpool supporters, who they claimed were drunk and rioting, though it was later concluded that the main cause was poor crowd control by the police. 3 days after the disaster, it was falsely reported on the front page of The Sun that some Liverpool fans had pickpocketed victims, urinated on police officers, and beat up an officer who was trying to save someone's life. They claimed that police had been scapegoated and that thousands of fans, many without tickets, had tried to force their way into the stadium, some even blackmailing police. Obviously this turned out not to be the case, but it took years for The Sun to eventually recant their claims and apologise, at which time the managing editor admitted it was, quote, "the worst mistake in our history." Many people and businesses in Liverpool boycott the paper to this day because of its coverage of the disaster. Throughout the 80s and 90s, numerous headlines referred to French people as frogs and Germans as Krauts or Hun. In July 2003, an article claimed that asylum seekers were slaughtering and eating swans, a totally fabricated story. In 2012, The Sun posted photos of Prince Harry naked that were taken while he was in a hotel room on holiday with friends in Las Vegas. Other British newspapers decided against doing so to protect his privacy because there was no public interest, yet The Sun claimed they were testing perception of freedom of the press. In June 2013, undercover reporter Maza Mahmood, who previously worked for News of the World and was involved in the fabricated Victoria Beckham kidnapping plot, before getting hired at The Sun on Sunday, wrote a story with the headline, "Chilesa's Cocaine Deal Shame." At the trial the following year, the judge said that there were strong grounds to believe that Marza had lied and tried to manipulate evidence against Chilesa, a singer. In 2015, columnist Katie Hopkins referred to migrants to Britain as cockroaches and feral humans and said they were spreading like the norovirus. In 2017, Trevor Kavanagh wrote an article for the paper that questioned what actions British society should take to deal with, quote, the Muslim problem, which was compared to the use of the phrase the Jewish problem prior to the Holocaust. In 2018, The Sun criticised 17-year-old Emmerdale actress Isabel Steele for covering up from head to toe and said she should, quote, flash a bit of flesh. In 2019, rugby player Gareth Thomas revealed that a journalist, who he didn't identify by name or newspaper they worked for, told his parents that he had HIV before he had a chance to himself, and it's speculated that the paper was The Sun, though not confirmed. In 2020, J.K. Rowling described her first marriage as violent, which led to The Sun interviewing her ex-husband and publishing a front-page story with the headline, "I slapped J.K. and I'm not sorry." The Sun eventually apologised for most of these incidents, but it was usually seen as too little or too late, as it was only when their views had been poorly received at the time, or years later when they were finally called out, that they decided to backtrack. Anyway, let's briefly jump back to the News of the World scandal. As part of the investigations, 31 employees of The Sun had been arrested by the end of February 2012. The Leveson inquiry had been probing the culture, practices and ethics of the British press since July 2011, and in February the following year, Sue Akers, Deputy Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, told the inquiry that they were investigating a, quote, network of corrupt officials, and that they had found evidence to suggest that there was a, quote, culture of illegal payments at The Sun authorised at a senior level. In the aftermath of the revelations, 6 senior staff and journalists, sometimes known as the Sun Six, were put on trial in October 2014, each charged with conspiring to commit misconduct in a public office after they had allegedly made illegal payments to public officials like police, prison officers and soldiers on numerous occasions. In January 2015, former reporter John Throop and picture editor John Edwards were acquitted. Deputy news editor Ben O'Driscoll and former managing editor Graham Dudman were partially cleared. A few days later, it became apparent that the jury weren't going to be able to reach a unanimous verdict on Ben and Graham's remaining charges, plus head of news Chris Farrow and district reporter Jamie Pyatt's charges. After a juror was discharged and the judge stated he would accept majority verdicts of 11-0 or 10-1, the jury was still unable to reach a decision and so a retrial was announced. Anyway, during the initial trial, Ben O'Driscoll, who denied 3 counts of conspiring, spoke about a huge safe full of information that the Sun had decided not to publicise. Quote, "It was an enormous safe, 7 foot high. It looks like something out of the Wild West. And that safe is full of about 30 years of stories which are confidential and did not pass the public interest test. What's in there is quite eye-popping, I must say. It would be photographs, videos, reports. Ordinarily it would involve MPs, celebrities, there are royals in there. If you were to publish everything in that safe, the Sun's circulation would go up. If we've learnt one thing so far, it's that the Sun will publish almost anything. They don't even care if it's true or not, as long as it gets people buying the paper. To solidify this even more, one of its best known headlines in March 1986 was "Freddie Starr ate my hamster," and the story alleged that he had eaten his partner's hamster in a sandwich because there was no food in the house. The story was totally fabricated by his partner, though it seems that the Sun were aware of that and published it anyway, because sales. In 2019, Will Haggerty wrote an article to celebrate 50 years of The Sun, in which he spoke about the hamster story. Quote, "This episode encapsulates the unique humour which has defined The Sun since its launch 50 years ago. A minor story plucked from nowhere, bestowed with a blockbuster headline which turned it into a national talking point, then a follow-up stunt that amplified the impact in an era long before social media." A minor story plucked from nowhere. I guess that's one way of blatantly admitting to fabricating it. Ben O'Driscoll said the information in the safe didn't pass the public interest test, but I'm not sure how many of their other stories did either. In addition to some of the controversies already covered, many of the stories were just mindless celebrity gossip. For example, about Michael Jackson sleeping in an oxygen tank, calling him Wacko Jacko. They even to this day have a section on the website for wardrobe malfunctions, showing various celebrities whose shirts have fallen down or their skirts have blown up. The majority of these are women. How is any of that in the public interest? They've proven time and time again that they don't care for facts, and they certainly don't care for feelings. So what is in that safe that even the Sun won't publish? There is some information that allows us to make somewhat of an educated guess. On the 18th of July 2015, the front page of The Sun showed a still from a quote, secret 1933 film that shows Edward VIII teaching this Nazi salute to the Queen. For context, Edward briefly became the king in 1936 for less than a year because he wanted to marry a woman who had been divorced, and after they married and became Duke and Duchess of Windsor in October 1937, they visited Germany and met with Hitler to discuss an international movement for peace on his terms. This led to numerous accusations that he was a Nazi sympathiser, though some historians believe he was simply trying to keep the peace. So who knows what his intentions were. But regardless, the Queen was 7 years old in that video. She obviously didn't know what that gesture meant, and it was years before the war anyway, so most of Hitler's actions were not widespread knowledge at that point. Peter Jukes covered the Sun's safe, also dubbed the Black Museum, in an article, and said that according to sources, the photos of the Queen doing the salute were kept in the safe for many years before they decided to release them. It's not clear why they were released. Perhaps some of the contents of the safe are being saved for a rainy day when nothing else is going on. There's not much significance in those photos, yet it sure makes for an eye-catching headline. From this, we can surmise that there are probably other compromising photos, videos and information about the royal family. Some have speculated naked photos, but The Sun already printed those photos of Prince Harry taken in a hotel room, which was already pushing the boundaries. Did they use even less ethical methods to obtain other inappropriate images? Rumour has it that there is evidence of celebrities engaging in inappropriate acts with animals, but surely that's exactly the kind of story The Sun would issue. Perhaps they were threatened with legal action, but lawyers of the royal family did that prior to the Prince Harry photos being leaked, and that didn't stop them. Regardless, that kind of contact with animals is illegal, so I don't think anyone engaging in such activity would have a leg to stand on in court. You can let your mind run wild with theories of what the safe might contain, but for most of that potential information, I can't understand why they wouldn't publish it, unless they're using it for blackmail purposes. This is total speculation on my part, but it makes sense. If they have dirt on public figures, enough to damage their reputations, but not necessarily anything illegal, like celebrities having affairs, they could probably blackmail them for other information they might have. Why out one celebrity for cheating on the wife when they could give you information about 6 other celebrities doing the same thing, or engaging in other, possibly even worse activities? It's interesting that The Sun sometimes won't reveal how they obtained certain information, like the aforementioned photos of the Queen, and if they weren't paying for such content, it makes sense that they had something on whoever gave them it. Why else would they even keep a safe full of stories if they decided they weren't in the public interest and they weren't going to publish them? The safe could basically be The Sun's burn book, though with information a bit more mature than Amber D'Alessio made out with a hot dog. It seems unlikely that the safe is filled with celebrity misdemeanours alone though, and it may actually contain evidence of serious crimes. According to Peter Jukes, when Rebecca Brooks became the first female editor for The Sun in 2003, she would openly talk with her friends about the safe and some of the scandals it contained. Quote, sources describe the names she mentioned as U-Tree type material. U-Tree presumably refers to Operation U-Tree, an investigation into various abuse allegations, mostly the abuse of children, by Jimmy Savile, Rolf Harris, and other notorious individuals. It can't be argued that releasing evidence of such criminal activity wouldn't be in the public interest, and so you have to question what hands are in which pockets for that to potentially be covered up. Former News of the World journalist Graham Johnson wrote a book titled Hack, which was described as, quote, a compelling and intoxicating story of one man's time in the tabloid jungle. In said book, he claimed that News International had deliberately suppressed evidence that author Arthur C. Clarke had inappropriate contact with children. Sri Lankan authorities apparently cleared him of the allegations shortly before his death, seemingly due to a lack of evidence, but there seems to be some contention over his innocence, and the Sunday Mirror reported that he had confessed to paying young boys to have inappropriate contact with him. He later denied that he was a paedophile, but never sued the paper for defamation. Graham Johnson told The Independent, Roger Insull said that because Arthur C. Clarke was a mate of Rupert Murdoch, the editor wasn't having any of it, and despite Roger getting a lot of evidence that Clarke was a paedophile, they wouldn't publish it. When asked about the story, Phil Hall, editor at the time, vaguely disputed this, saying, I can vaguely remember that story. I do remember that Roger Insull worked on it, and I remember it was not published. My only recollection is that the only reason we wouldn't publish it was because of legal reasons. Whether or not Arthur Clarke was innocent is somewhat irrelevant, as no one could have known at the time, so if Graham is telling the truth, it's highly unethical that Rupert Murdoch may have suppressed evidence that could have outed Arthur and therefore potentially saved children from abuse because they were pals. I'll leave you to make your own mind up on that one, as I can't confirm the validity of Graham or Phil's claims. If such evidence existed though, it's possibly one of the many scandals that would be uncovered if the contents of the safe were ever leaked. Interestingly, this is not the only time that Rupert's papers have been accused of covering up similar behaviour because he was friends with the accused. Soon after the death of Cyril Smith, a member of the Liberal Democrats and MP for Rochdale between 1972 and 1992, it was revealed that he had inappropriate contact with a number of underage boys. The Rochdale Alternative Press had covered some of the earlier allegations in 1979, though it was a small local paper, and a short-lived police investigation did not lead to a conviction, even though he had been discovered to be in possession of CP in the 1980s. According to the BBC, he was released after a few hours in custody, the evidence was destroyed, and officers on the case were not allowed to discuss it further. When one officer found Cyril in the home of a known offender with 2 drunk teenage boys and a police sergeant in plain clothes, he was made to attend a meeting with a senior officer and told in no uncertain terms not to talk about what he'd seen. Margaret Thatcher, former Prime Minister, was aware of the allegations, and yet Cyril was still knighted in 1988. All this suggested that a cover-up was indubitable, but was the Sun or News International involved? According to the Daily Mail, there was a burglary at the Sun's Fleet Street offices in 1982, in which a copy of the police file on Cyril was found, leading to speculation that the break-in was linked to attempts to cover up the crimes. If this is true, it sounds like there's a good chance that this is where the 7-foot safe is located, but more to the point, it begs the question, why on earth did the Sun not publish this? It was a much bigger paper than the Rochdale Alternative Press, so had it reported on the story when the police file was first received, the public would have known about the crimes, and Cyril may have even been prosecuted. Instead, he died, having faced no consequences despite shamelessly admitting to some of the allegations. It's sounding increasingly likely that the contents of the safe, if ever publicised, would not only damage reputations, but could potentially result in criminal investigations that never happened before due to cover-ups. That said, it's important to note that the existence of the safe hasn't been definitively proven, nor has its potential contents. I'd be willing to bet that The Sun and other newspapers have a plethora of juicy stories that they never published, and the claim of a 7-foot high safe containing 30 years worth of information does seem pointlessly specific if it's not true. Rupert Murdoch apparently used to brag about having dirt on people, according to Michael Wolff, who wrote a biography about him. Murdoch, a gossip hound, often announced during our conversations that he had damaging pictures of this or that enemy. However, when Peter Jukes asked him to elaborate, he said this multiple times, Wolff explained, with demonic chuckle, we have pictures, but when I asked him about this, it seemed more like he had been told we have pictures, and I got the feeling he was often told we have pictures without there necessarily being pictures. Various people at various papers would say to me, he thinks we have pictures, and then they would chuckle too. Most of the behaviour at News Corp was geared to keeping the old man happy, and if that involved him believing they ran a sophisticated intelligence operation, so be it, even if they were not so sophisticated and not so intelligent. If such a safe ever did exist, it's possible that it has since been destroyed. Ben O'Driscoll stopped working for The Sun in 2011, meaning according to him, the stories, photos and videos in the safe date back to the early 80s. That was over 10 years ago now though, and there's every chance that the contents of the safe were discarded after the phone hacking scandal or around the time of the Sun 6 trial, especially if some of that information was obtained through illegal means. The Sun 6 were all eventually cleared of the charges, and it makes sense that other employees wouldn't want to risk a trial themselves if word got out about the safe. I don't doubt the Sun and other newspapers still have stories they chose not to publish, but I'm not sure keeping them in a huge safe would be the wisest decision. A warrant to search it could be obtained in certain situations, and one of the offices has been burglarised in the past. Whether it exists or existed or not, it's highly unlikely that all of its hypothetical contents would ever be released to the public, as there must be a reason it hasn't been already. Perhaps when certain people die and there's no longer a reason to protect certain shady individuals, or if, for whatever reason, an argument can be made that some of the stories are in the public interest, we might one day get to hear them, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the Sun's safe exists? And if so, what kind of stories do you think it contains? If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my patrons, whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday in a new video.